So now we want to drill down a little bit into this access theory of consciousness, and we're going to find one particular elaboration of the idea, the broad notion of access consciousness, within a theory known as Global Workspace Theory. This is by no means the only theory of access consciousness, and it serves certain purposes only. Global Workspace Theory makes use of a metaphor that many have found helpful. In this metaphor, your consciousness, your personal experience is a kind of a theater. Imagine it like a theater. And there's a spotlight, and the spotlight can only shine on a certain amount of stuff at the same time. And the stuff that you can report on is the stuff that the spotlight is on. You can think of this, if you like, as the spotlight of attention. So as the spotlight moves around the theater, so your attention moves over the contents of consciousness. But of course, the spotlight has only a limited capacity to illuminate something. It can't shine on the entire theater all at once. Likewise, your attentional capacity is limited. And so you can only, as it were, bear a finite small number of things in mind at any given time. The number of things that you could potentially pay attention to or bring to mind, as we say, is essentially unlimited. So coming back to the theater analogy, the entire building of the theater, the backstage, where the audience sits and so on, all this is vast, and you can think of that, if you like, as the unconscious, the stuff that the spotlight could shine on but is not. So let's explore this metaphor, and it is just a metaphor, it is not a theory, it's a metaphor, a little further. Here we are looking from above, looking down onto the theater. We see the conscious spotlight, the spotlight of attention there, and we see that it could draw from language, from memory, from expectations, could be informed by perception, and so on. The bright spot is the spotlight of attention, and it's very, very limited. The idea and this metaphor is that sensory stuff constitutes inputs which compete for access to the spotlight. So that itch that finally gets your attention has sort of demanded that the spotlight come over to it. The stage over which the spotlight roams is a domain known as working memory. And working memory has a finite but decent sized capacity, and you may have a lot more stored in long-term memory and so on, and that's further away, as it were, and something that to which you wish to pay attention has to be sort of dragged from long-term memory. Let's think of your summer holiday last year in the beach house. Now we've set the stage, as we say, and now we can attend to selective parts of that experience, of that memory, that time you went to the restaurant or to the beach, and so on. So the capacity of the unconscious is essentially unlimited here. The capacity of working memory is limited, and the capacity of the spotlight is smaller still. Now this is, again, just a metaphor, but it has been used in order to design certain models which make specific predictions. We're going to talk in particular about global workspace theory, which draws on this metaphor. The idea behind global workspace theory is that it adopts, first of all, the computational theory of mind, and it speaks of what is going on in the mind/brain, which it probably equates as processing. And lots of this processing is unconscious. So, for example, something flashes and goes away again, and you don't know what it was. Maybe it was a word, maybe it wasn't around long enough for you to see, but it's probably, there's something going on, you're processing it, but you don't have the outcome of that yet. So lots of processing is unconscious, like the early stages of word recognition. But there comes a point at which, assuming that something sticks around long enough, that you become aware of it. And this becoming aware of something is equated here to it being globally available. The idea being that prior to the entry of something into access consciousness, limited parts of the brain are concerned with preliminary processing. And when they finally make it to the point where something can be recognized, identified, or reported on, this now creates a resource that many other processes and or parts of the brain can draw from. Here's an experiment that fleshes these ideas out. It's by Stan Dehane from 2001. And in this experiment, subjects sit in front of a screen, which can be used to flash up very brief stimuli in rapid succession. Most of the stimuli are just jumbles of visual noise. And then every now and then there's gaps, and sometimes words pop up very, very briefly. And a word will pop up very briefly, and it can be followed either by a blank screen or by a visual pattern. The idea being that if it's followed by a blank screen, you have a sort of a retinal after image which might facilitate your recognition of the word, whereas if it's followed by more visual noise, you will never recognize what the word is. So here's an illustration of the manner in which stimuli are presented. On the left, you see noise followed by a blank screen, followed by either the word lion or nothing, followed by a blank screen. So the word lion is there for 29 milliseconds only, followed by a blank screen for 71 milliseconds, followed by more noise. Contrast that with the right-hand side, where we have a similar succession. In this particular case, the word note here is followed by visual noise. So the idea is that the word lion is going to be easier to recognize than note, because when they're both on screen for a very short period of time. But after lion, you have sort of a period in which to reflect or to process, in the language of this theory, which may facilitate recognition. So you do this, and in this case, this was done in the context of an fMRI experiment. Words presented, so they belong to two conditions. One condition is followed by a blank screen, and the other condition, the word, is followed by visual noise, mask as we call it. The visual mask prevents you recognizing the word, and this is the condition labeled there on the right as unconscious. What we see in this condition is regional blood flow in small specific areas of the brain, but very few, the effect on the brain of exposure, brief exposure to this word followed by noise, is very limited. Contrast that with the plot on the left there, where you can see this is the case where the word was followed by a blank screen. And now we suddenly see a great deal of increase in regional blood flow in this condition. The experiment has been carefully calibrated so that in the so-called unconscious condition, people cannot report the word. In the conscious condition, they can report the word. You can see the use of this term access consciousness here. And this is consistent with the idea, which Global Workspace Theory suggests, which distinguishes between conscious and unconscious processing and suggests that the unconscious processing serves to make products, as it were, available to more broadly distributed processes. And when they do so, something enters access consciousness, and that then is reflected by this widespread activity in the whole brain. Now, based on this experiment alone, we could say very, very little. There would be an infinite number of ways to interpret this. This kind of work looks a little better when you triangulate using various methods. So here you can still see the two conditions from the fMRI experiment, but in the middle you see some data from an EEG experiment in which event-related potentials were obtained. These, of course, are obtained by averaging over very, very many trials in order to distinguish between the effect on the brain of one condition versus another condition. In the middle, you can see these plots. You can see the green trace is clearly distinct from the red trace, and those are the event-related potentials associated with the two conditions, one in which you have access to the word and one in which you don't have access to the word. So this EEG analysis fits in nicely with the fMRI analysis and suggests there's something qualitatively different between these two conditions, one in which you are able to report on the word and one in which you're not. Now, the entire language in which this theory is couched belongs to a specific corner of the world. It belongs to the cognitivist approaches that understand the processes of cognition to be best described as a form of information processing. That is the transformation of representations based on inputs and generating outputs. We have encountered this approach very many times. It is entirely orthodox. It is also not the only approach that is available to us. And one thing I'd like you to think about is what kind of facts about a person or their behavior could this kind of approach deal with, and what kind of approach can this not deal with. Some of the competing approaches that we don't have time to explore here go by clear names. The extended mind hypothesis, for example, rejects the idea that when we're talking about minds, we should be talking about what's going on in the brain, but we should also be talking about what's going on in the whole body and the world. Distributed cognition is another framework in which cognition is not even an achievement of individual brains, but of many, many people interacting over time. So there are other perspectives available, many of which we unfortunately don't have time to pursue. So this served to show us how one particular way in which we come at this difficult word consciousness, first by noting access consciousness as a special use of the term, then by developing a metaphor, which is the theatre metaphor, with the spotlight of attention, gives rise to a specific kind of theory which can admit of experiment and modeling.